There's nothing I like more, as a scholar of the West and as a generally curious person, than when I either find a topic I knew nothing about, or discover that a familiar topic I thought I knew well turns out to be profoundly more complicated and fascinating than I would have ever imagined. Chances are, if you know the right questions to ask, this is the case with nearly every topic. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. This month we are joined by Professor Ernesto Sagas, who helps us ask such revelatory questions in his book, Latino Colorado, The Struggle for Equality in the Centennial State. Whatever you think you know about Spanish-speaking populations in Colorado, historic or contemporary, I promise you there's a lot more to the story. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Ernesto Sagas is a professor of ethnic studies at Colorado State University. He holds a PhD in political science, an MA in Latin American studies from the University of Florida, and a bachelor's in history from the University of Puerto Rico, Magalles. Prior to his appointment at Colorado State University in 2008, he was faculty in political science and Puerto Rican, Latin American, and Hispanic Caribbean studies programs at Lehman College at the City University of New York, Bronx, John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, Rutgers University, and Southern New Hampshire University. He is the author of an enormous body of scholarship, including articles and book chapters in a variety of disciplines, and 5 books: Race and Politics in the Dominican Republic, The Dominican People, A Documentary History, Dominican Migration, Transnational Perspectives, Dominican Politics in the 21st Century, Continuity and Change, and finally, Latino Colorado, The Struggle for Equality in the Centennial State, published just this year, 2025, by the University Press of Colorado. In Latino Colorado, Sagas digs through the near 2-century history of Spanish-speaking peoples in the land that became Colorado. He follows a simultaneous geographic and chronologic organization, starting in the San Luis Valley, which was settled by Spanish-speaking peoples from points south in the mid-19th century at the same moment that Americans were arriving from the east. That resulting community served as a Hispano homeland that subsequent generations would maintain ties to, even as they migrated north to the eastern plains of Colorado in the early 20th century and elsewhere. Those mobile communities were often drawn by labor in the agricultural sector, especially with sugar beets. Their numbers were supplemented in the 1940s and 60s Bracero program, which brought an enormous influx of new Mexican laborers to the state. Their children formed the core of the Chicano movement, which arose in the 1960s in Front Range urban centers. Sagas shifts to the western slope to investigate late 20th and early 21st century immigrant labor, driven by growing New West amenity economies, among others. These new populations diversified the countries of origin for Colorado's Latino populations. And along the way of these centuries of history, groups intermingled, intermarried, and maintain transnational connections in ways that demonstrate just how not homogenous Latino Colorado has been or is today. I'm particularly enthused by Sagas's work as a part of a growing body of scholarship about the American West that is being produced by scholars whose initial or primary expertise is not grounded in the region. Sagas and others offer us new lenses through which to examine and enrich what we know and teach about the region. There's always more to the story, and his and others' outside perspectives provide us exciting new ways to discover just how much more. Professor Ernesto Sagas, welcome to Writing Westward.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor.
I'm really excited to chat. Listeners may or may not be aware, but we collaborated, quite a few years ago. We brought you here to the Red Center for a seminar, and then you published a chapter in a book that I edited. And yeah, it's always fun to reconnect with old friends.
Yeah, that was back in 2019, and actually, that helped me. It re-energized me to finish this project that had been sitting on my shelf for quite a while. My life had gone in a different direction academically, and then I just retook it from there.
It's a perfect segue. So I already mentioned in the introduction, but you've taught Latino studies, Caribbean studies, ethnic studies for a good 25 years in New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, before coming to Colorado State. And most of your scholarly publishing was on the Caribbean, Latin American studies, and Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. And so I wanted to ask kind of about the scholarly path that brought you to write a monograph focusing on Colorado, Latino history. How and when and why did you decide to start investigating this regional Western story?
Yeah, so it was shortly after I moved here, 2008. That's when I started teaching at CSU, and a course that I had taught before since the 1990s back east, when Latino, Latina, at some point Latinx studies was emerging, was this survey, this intro course to Latino, Latinx populations in the U.S. So I started teaching here. So I would like to add a Colorado component to it, and then I realized there wasn't much. I mean, here I was in a state that its name is Colorado in Spanish. There are so many place names that there's a fifth of the state's population that is Hispanic or Latinx, and there was very, very little outside of some books about the folklore, the culture of the San Luis Valley. There's a great monograph about the Chicano movement, but that's it. It was either the San Luis Valley or the Chicano movement. So I said, what? There's a niche there. There's a book in the making there. So besides my own comparative work on the Hispanic Caribbean, I'm a political scientist by training. For years, I have worked on the Dominican Republic and Haiti, also done some work on Puerto Rico, Cuba. I decided that this was going to be a kind of my kind of a debt to the state that had adopted me. I fell in love with Colorado since day one, and I'm burying my bones here. I just love the place, and I said that this is my way of paying back to this state. And of course, there's also the academic component of filling this niche in the literature, this gap actually in the literature. And what is interesting, coming from this background in Latin American studies, specifically the Caribbean, I saw so many connections to the American West when it came to colonialism, to neocolonialism, to plantations, to the relationship of those economic sectors in the American West to cheap labor, whether it was domestic or imported cheap labor. I said there are many, many parallels here. And actually, there was a very clear parallel regarding the big sugar industry that was expanding in the early 20th century here in Colorado, at the same time that it was expanding in places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. It was the same company operating under very different names. So there was this vertical integration of all these companies that existed on paper, but it was pretty much the same people running the sugar business in the Caribbean and the sugar business in the American West in pretty much very, very similar ways.
Oh, that's interesting. So you speak to this gap in the literature, but we can kind of interpret that more broadly in terms of, so there's not just a gap in the scholarly production of Spanish-speaking populations in Colorado, the general public does not thinks of Colorado, I think, as a very white space,
Yeah.
despite its name being Colorado, right? And despite it, having been part of, New Spain and Mexico after that. So, kind of in the public consciousness, there's also this gap that needs to be filled, or that you need to shine a spotlight and say, "Hey, there are Spanish-speaking people here, and there have been for a really long time."
Yeah, and I would say that more than a gap, it's more like a blind spot. It has been ignored by historians, by social scientists for so long, and the history of the state of Colorado is the history of Hispanics or the original Hispanos that actually settled the territory right after the takeover by the U.S. military during the war with Mexico. Before that, there were some forays, some summer camps established in what was the San Luis Valley, but there was no permanent presence. So one of the ironies of the Latinx, Hispanic, Hispano presence in Colorado is that it starts at the same point that the American occupation of the West begins. So as settlers from the East came into what eventually will become the Colorado Territory, also settlers from the South via
Huh.
New Mexico came here. So the history of the Latino presence in Colorado is very much an American history.
This is one of the big critiques people have always had with Frederick Jackson Turner, right? That he was so focused on this east to west frontier and migration patterns and settlement patterns. But what about the south to north? I mean, even thinking back when I was an undergrad, the first course that I took in American West history, I think the official course title was Westward Expansion. So embedded within the course title was the framework of its people from the east coming to the west. And in that class, we did talk about the Spanish frontier and that, but it's kind of baked in that we don't think about south coming north. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it goes beyond the 19th century. I mean that frontier is still alive for people that migrate from points south. So the Latinx or Hispanic perspective of the United States, and particularly of Colorado, revolves around a north-south axis. It's a movement to the north and back and forth. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that it's no longer like a one-way street or a two-way road. It's this transnational network of people, ideas, products, culture moving around back and forth and between different parts of Mexico, parts of Latin America, and parts of Colorado, the region, and the United States.
One thing I wanted to ask that I probably should have started with was about your personal connection to the West more broadly prior to coming to Colorado State in 2008. Did you have much engagement with the West as a region before that?
Yeah, I'm a very outdoorsy person, even since I was a kid. So a little bit about my background. I feel that I'm a person with no roots whatsoever. My grandparents emigrated, or more precisely, escaped from Spain to the New World. My parents came from Cuba and the Dominican Republic to the United States. I was born in New York, yet I was raised in Puerto Rico because they moved there. So I always felt out of place among my extended Cuban Dominican family in Puerto Rico. And of course, I feel like an immigrant back to the United States because I left, or my parents, took me away from New York City when I was barely 3 years old. So I have no recollection of life in the U.S. So I came stateside for grad school after spending my childhood in Puerto Rico. And even though it may feel like growing up in paradise, it's a small island. I always felt kind of trapped there, and that I didn't belong, that I was not a Puerto Rican, even though I have come of age there. We had like no relatives there. And one place that always intrigued me was the American West. And I always remember having this kind of a postcard, and it was Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And I would stare at it for like minutes and minutes. I said, one day I'm gonna go and see this place. And I've always been a kind of a geography buff. So I ended up going to grad school in Florida, working the East Coast, but I was always looking west. And here's the irony. I arrived in 2008 in Fort Collins, being pretty rootless. New England was pretty shocking to me. I spent 5 years in New Hampshire, and there were people there that could trace their ancestry back to the Mayflower. I was like, always the eternal outsider, and New Hampshire is a very, very white state. So I moved here, and then I found out that, most people here don't go back more than one generation. They're all newcomers attracted to the West by the same things that attracted me, pretty much the scenery. Some of my colleagues complain about the lack of diversity here in Fort Collins. So, what are you talking about? I just came from a state that is 95% white. Okay, there were more Africans than African Americans in New Hampshire when I was there. That was quite shocking. So in a place where no one save for the indigenous people have roots, I felt at home. So that was what really attracted me, and then the rest is history.
So do you now think of yourself as a Westerner, or what do you think of Western? Like what do you categorize as quote unquote Western identity, and do you identify with that?
I do. I do. I feel that the West is a place of transience, and I just move around so much. It's a place where people reinvent themselves, where people grow roots. And here in a place like Fort Collins, where you have so many faculty going in and out, it's very, very hard to find people that will call themselves like Fort Collins natives, and usually that doesn't go beyond one generation, and it just cracks me up when I see those Colorado native bumper stickers on the highway. So yeah, here this place has this sense of everything is so new here. These people just got here, so in that Western sense of reinvention and everything of newness, I feel Western.
That's so great to bring up because for a lot of people, if you were to say, what's Western identity? That's not what they think of. They think of like, oh yeah, like old pioneer stock or like rugged individuals, or all this stuff. But there's been so much work done, over the last few decades showing that the West is so much more than that. And as you say, one of the real through lines in the last century or so in the West is transience. It's people moving. It's a highly mobile population. But I don't think the general public, I don't think thinks of that as quote unquote distinctly Western. But I think it really is a core part of, especially places like Colorado, say like Phoenix, places where so much of the population has really just arrived, maybe in the last 2 generations.
Yeah, particularly here in places like Denver, Fort Collins, it's very young people in their late 20s, early 30s, yuppies, without children that are attracted, by the outdoor amenities. And they arrive here, and circling back to the book, they arrive here and they have no idea what to expect of Colorado except for the ski slopes and the breweries of Denver, and they all of a sudden realize that, oh, who are these Hispanic or Latino people? You mean to say that they have always been here, or are they just immigrants that arrive? And the irony here is that these people kind of we call it they move from other states, but in a sense they also migrated from other states here, just like people migrated from points south or from other parts of the United States.
Yeah, some of the same push-pull dynamics that
Attracted
it
by
happens within the country as well.
economic factors, attracted by jobs,
Yeah.
by the old and the new economies of the West.
Let's dig into the book. So one of the big takeaways that I gained from your participation in our Red Center seminar and then your chapter in the book was just how historically and in contemporary times, how diverse Spanish-speaking populations in Colorado are. And it made me be more careful about how I think about Spanish-speaking populations in the West, right? And what terms I use: Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Chicano, and some of the assumptions I bring when thinking about their histories and experiences. And I was already, somewhat aware that it's not a homogenous population. In places like New Mexico, there's this long, complicated history of why some families call themselves Nuevo Mexicanos or Californios in California, that they're trying to assert their Spanish colonial roots as opposed to new coming immigrant Latino population. So I'd known there's these divisions, but I'd never thought about applying that same sensitivity to other places in the West, like Colorado. So, acknowledging that there's this continuum of people coming and going over, a couple centuries, I wanted to maybe start our conversation by talking a little bit about some of these important distinctions between unique and different Spanish-speaking populations in Colorado. And we can maybe even just do this by working through the book, which you divide into kind of geographic, chronologic chapters. So maybe let's start with what you already mentioned, the San Luis Valley and some of those early stages of Hispanic migration northward. Like, tell us about that population, when they come, why they come, and what kind of presence they assert in the territory that becomes Colorado.
Yeah, the San Luis Valley is a fascinating place because it's part of what has been called the Hispano homeland. But again, it's not settled until after the arrival of the U.S. military, after the creation or the establishment of forts, initially Fort Massachusetts, later Fort Garland.
So prior to 1848, there's maybe some Spanish-speaking traders, but there's no permanent settlements, agriculture, that kind of stuff?
No, there were some summer camps. There was what I call forays. But again, because the presence of the Mexican state is so limited, they're enticing people with these land grants to settle there, but they cannot provide the security. So they always have the problem of indigenous nations coming and claiming what was rightfully theirs and pushing them out. So they will, go there for the summer, but there are no permanent settlements. Okay. So the first permanent settlement that we have to this day is the town of San Luis in the southern part of the San Luis Valley, right across the state line with New Mexico, and that goes back to 1851. So it's not until the U.S. Army can provide protection for the settlers that then there's a kind of a spillover effect from the New Mexico territory into southern Colorado. At the same time that Easterners are also coming to Colorado. So nothing permanent. Actually, even before that, in the 1840s, earlier 1840s, what nowadays Colorado is Pueblo, Colorado, there was a settlement called El Pueblo, but it was destroyed after an indigenous attack.
So even that first Spanish settlement in San Luis it existed because of U.S. military fort protection?
Precisely. So Taos and villages north of Taos, that was as far as the Spanish and later Mexican presence went. So the Mexican and the Spanish flag never flew technically over the territory of Colorado, even though the Spanish claim it on the map and the Mexican Republic also claim it, but there was no permanent presence. So it is part of this Hispanic or Hispano homeland, but it's a homeland that is created, that is a spillover effect. Okay. And once the territory of Colorado is created and there's this artificial territorial line and later the state line, then they are cut off politically from New Mexico. So you don't have the same demographic weight, the same demographic critical mass that, for example, Hispanics had in northern New Mexico. In Colorado, they still are numerous or comparatively numerous in the San Luis Valley. They even got legislators elected to the Territorial Assembly. They participate in the drafting of the Constitution, which, by the way, the first Constitution of the state of Colorado was printed in English, Spanish, and German because of German immigrants coming from to the mines. So there's this created or recreated homeland that is the heart of the Hispanic Latinx community in Colorado, which is the San Luis Valley, that, as we know, geographically extends into northern New Mexico.
It's interesting to think about the influence of that arbitrary dividing line between the territories, New Mexico and Colorado, because I think of Rosina Lozano's recent book, An American Language, where she's talking about New Mexico and just how long Spanish persisted in governmental affairs, in judicial affairs as like an official language of record. But this exact same, or descendants of that same population north of that state or territory line didn't enjoy that.
No,
in the San Luis Valley.
Yeah, there's actually a book called Pleas and Petitions, and it's regarding the legislators that are elected from the San Luis Valley, the Spanish-speaking legislators that have to go then to the Territorial Assembly and later to the State House, and they're constantly petitioning for interpreters, for laws to be translated into Spanish, and they're rebuffed all the time.
So how does the San Luis Valley settlement and kind of culture develop then over the those decades of the late 19th, and I mean all the way up through to the present.
Yeah.
What is that Hispanic, Spanish-speaking population's story?
So it's the proverbial circling of the wagons. As in every other part of the West, as gold and silver was discovered in the mountains, Anglo settlers came. First, it was the miners, then eventually it would be the settlers. There you have your typical ranch wars. Many of these Hispano ranchers, they were into the sheep business, but then later cattle came in. They had a very different perception of land tenure and water rights. So they had what in English is called the commons. Okay, so they will settle these land grants and they will use water rights in common. They even had a mayordomo who was a person in charge of allocating water rights. And then, of course, they're taken over by an American, by an Anglo system in which land is a commodity, in which the commons doesn't occupy a central place, in which water rights are very different. First claim, you get to keep water rights pretty much forever. So they start, obviously, as it's the pattern in other parts of the West, they start losing their lands to lawyers, to speculators, to swindlers, to violent takeovers, and they pretty much start looking inward. They engage the Anglo economy when needed, but pretty much they will stick to their villages, they will stick to the language, and as the traditional economic sectors of the West expand, mining, railroads, and ranching or agribusinesses, then they start partaking into this new Anglo economy. Okay, so there's a process of resistance, but also accommodation to the new Anglo norms, to the new Anglo legal system, as we have seen in other parts of the West, but under very different conditions, because initially they are the demographic majority, but very soon more Anglos start coming into the San Luis Valley, and they're cut off from New Mexico politically.
And far from the center of power in Denver. It's a trip to get all the
Pretty
way
much,
south.
yeah, and Denver at some point demographically starts growing, and there are numerous Anglos, in Denver, and what is nowadays called the Front Range starts developing. So the San Luis Valley starts becoming more of a backwater in Colorado's history, but it's still the heart, the homeland of the Hispanic community, and as they start radiating outward the San Luis Valley towards the new economic sectors out in the plains, out on the Front Range, periodically they will go back to the San Luis Valley to kind of recharge their cultural batteries and then go back. But at some point, that demographic weight shifts from the San Luis Valley to the Front Range. So right now, you can take all the Hispanics of the San Luis Valley and you can fit them in one neighborhood of Denver.
Interesting.
But it's still historically, culturally seen as the heartland, as the homeland of Colorado's Latinx experience.
Well, this gets us a little bit into your next book chapter, where you do move into the early 20th century agriculture out on Colorado's eastern plains. But even at that point, you're saying that there still was this return. The San Luis Valley was still kind of the hub from which they were radiating out, but always coming back and maintaining those ties a little bit.
Yeah, and initially, a lot of that out migration into the big sugar industry of the Eastern Plains was young men. They will seasonally go and work on the sugar beet fields, and then they will come home with the money, and the women will stay home. And actually, a very interesting dynamic, because women will be in charge for months of the household. So they are very much empowered by the fact that the men are now gone. So it's a very different dynamic. Then all of a sudden, these sugar companies realize that this is not profitable, because we're losing our workers at the end of every season. So they start creating what are called the colonias, these ethnic neighborhoods, very close to the center of production, or they start convincing local producers. So you have a combination of a plantation-like production of sugar beets, but also some outsourcing in which local farmers will grow beets, and they will welcome what they call a Mexican family, in quotation marks, and they will prepare a shack and the family will live there. So there's a transition in the labor pool from young men, single young men, then to entire families. And then the dynamic changes. Then the whole family is working in the sugar business, including children, and they are establishing growing roots there, and they're not going back to the San Luis Valley that often. So now you have an expanding frontier radiating out of the San Luis Valley into the Eastern Plains. And that begins in the 20th century. And oftentimes, another trope of Colorado is that it's this, mining state. But by the early 20th century, the real gold is sugar. So revenue coming from sugar beets outpaces mining. So that's where the real money is. And you have all these very powerful companies with deep pockets, large capital investments, land acquisition coming from the east, and then transforming the nature of the Eastern Plains. And in that part and parcel of that story is this cheap labor force that is made of what are called Mexicans in quotation marks. So these are the Hispanos or Mexican Americans, second, third, fourth. I mean, this is the early 20th century. It has been over half a century since the American takeover. So these are people that increasingly are English dominant, that have less of a connection to the culture of the San Luis Valley. And then early in the 20th century, you have migration from across the border with Mexico. So you have a combination of Hispanos, Mexican Americans, and then Mexican immigrants. I always tell my students that the Latinx population of Colorado is like a wedding cake, like a multi-layer wedding cake that has been left out in the sun and it has kind of imploded. So there's intermarriage, between the Hispanos that they feel that they're a bit better than people coming from Mexico and look at them, kind of over the shoulder because we are U.S. citizens and you are not, the usual tensions that go on to this day. But there's a great deal of intermarriage. And then these ethnic neighborhoods are the beginning of what will eventually become not only a permanent presence out there in the plains, but as the plains depopulated in the late 20th century, the percentage of Hispanics or Latinos in the Eastern Plains has increased, which is a similar story to what you see also in other states of the High Plains. One of the ironies that we see in Colorado's agriculture nowadays, that not only is most of the land in the hands of non-Hispanic whites, but most of the labor is what is called, again, Mexican labor, Mexican American and increasingly first-generation immigrants. The children of these ranchers and farmers oftentimes go to college, leave the state or move to Denver. So there you have the old farmer or the old rancher still trying to hold to the ranch, and the only people that will come and work for him are first-generation immigrants from rural places in Mexico. So they are united by their love of the land. And so the so-called revival of the Eastern Plains in many ways is thanks to Latinx or Latin American immigration.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I have so many things to say. So first, really interesting to think about this dynamic of single male laborers going out, leaving the San Luis Valley, going out, and then coming back and bringing the money. This kind of exact same dynamic we see in later generations, but across international borders, right? Of seasonal,
Pretty much.
Mexican or Latin American single male laborers coming up to the United States and then sending money home, right? But
Yes.
this is all happening within Colorado. So it's interesting to see that kind of system or network on a micro scale, which is then later kind of echoed on much larger transnational scales.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenon that goes across multiple generations now into the 21st century. And one of the arguments that I make is that it's an old phenomenon, but with a new twist. Now everything is faster and everything is more connected. Whereas it took them hours, or in the case of people coming from south of the border, days to get here. Now they take a plane and they get here in just a couple of hours, and they can send money in an instantaneous manner back home, or they can pick up a cell phone and get on their WhatsApp and video chat with their families. So it's the same phenomenon, but has been sped up by improvements in transportation and communications technology.
I don't want to derail us, but I am fascinated by what you mentioned of mining being a primary economic driver in Colorado, but then that shifting to agriculture at some point. And a lot of the most exciting mining history that I've enjoyed in recent years in Colorado has been about the labor movements. And you mentioned that this sugar beet and broader agricultural world that starts growing is being run by huge companies that wield enormous economic and political power. And that makes me think, oh, just like the mining companies before them. And so it makes me wonder, has anyone done comparative work on like the labor and labor strife in Colorado or maybe even the broader West of kind of the relationship of workers in mining to their companies and then agricultural workers that are being driven by these large companies in, a couple generations later?
Yeah, there's some work on that, and of course in Colorado we have the infamous Ludlow massacre of miners that included a large percentage of Mexican American families, Eastern European families coming from Colorado. But yeah, I mean, it's the typical history of the American West of large companies coming from the East and investing large amounts of capital, bringing all this technology, creating enclave-like economic sectors, very few horizontal linkages to the neighboring communities, and then an export-oriented community economy based on the extraction of raw materials, whether it's coal mining, for example, or sugar beets. And something that is interesting, I mentioned in the book and the chapter about the Eastern Plains, there's this collusion between the mining companies and the sugar companies. The sugar companies needed workers from spring into fall, and then they didn't want to lose them. So they started attracting families and all that. But then they get in collusion with the coal company and say, we'll send you workers come winter and they can work in the mines, but you send us your workers back come spring. So that way they keep this pool of cheap labor in place year long. And that in a way leads to the creation of deeply rooted Hispanic or Latinx communities along the Front Range. Remember, a lot of this mining, for example, took place around what nowadays is Boulder, a college town. And then that makes Latinos gravitate towards what eventually would be the Front Range.
Talk to us about how some of the early, I guess, into mid 20th century events like the Great Depression, the Bracero program, World War II, the subsequent deportation programs. How does that impact these Spanish-speaking populations, especially, I guess, a lot kind of in that Eastern Plains area?
Yeah, it brings another layer, and in the case of the Bracero program, is a huge layer. Okay, again, we have this history of Latinos in Colorado originating in the San Luis Valley, but numerically speaking, that is a very small, pretty tiny population. But in the Bracero program, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of people crossing the border, coming to the U.S., going back and forth between Mexico and the U.S., and hundreds of thousands of them staying. And in Colorado, it has a very powerful impact, and throughout the American West. Actually, the majority of Mexican Americans trace their roots not to the 1848 generation, but actually to the Bracero generation. And most importantly, the Bracero generation, their children are going to be the ones that carry the standard, the torch during the Chicano movement. So we have
because they're now American citizens born
they
here.
are,
Yeah.
and not only that, they experience the experience going through public education in the United States, being taught that you can grow up to become president of the U.S., but they end up doing the same kind of low-paying, dirty jobs that their parents were doing, now more in an urban setting than in a rural setting. So that is a significant demographic cohort that comes as a result of the Bracero program. In the heels, of course, of World War II, where you have then a displacement of both men and women, men mostly going to the battlefront, women going to industries. And that also comes in the heels of the Great Depression, where, if you remember, there's the massive deportation, also called the repatriation of Mexicans, in which probably more than half of those so-called Mexicans were U.S. citizens.
It's interesting. I'm seeing a connection. I wanted to move on to kind of this 1960s, 70s, Chicano political organizing movement. But when we talk about the Red Power movement and the American Indian movement, a lot of that grows out of Native teens and then into their 20s who had been growing up now in urban settings and thinking about and in public education and learning about the American dream and saying, oh, like that's being denied to us. And it's in those urban settings that they start to organize. So there's a similar dynamic, interestingly, here then on the Front Range of the children of some of these agricultural laborers and stuff getting together and starting to organize. How does the Chicano rights movement kind of unfold in Colorado?
Yeah, so it's kind of like all the planets aligning. So they are in urban settings. They're living in close contact with each other. They're going to public schools. It's the television generation of the 1960s. So they know what's going on, say, in the U.S. South, where African Americans are fighting for civil rights. They know what is happening back east. They know what is happening on the West Coast in San Francisco. So this is the 1960s. If you're under 30, you don't trust your elders. People are marching for women's rights, drugs, sex, and rock and roll, the hippie movement, American Indian movement. Everything is going on. And of course, in the Front Range, particularly in the Denver metro area, you have the critical mass of Mexican Americans that now are rescuing this term called Chicano and are brandishing Chicano as a symbol of pride. And what is interesting is that there's an international component to it. It's this rejection of colonialism, including internal colonialism in the United States. So they would say, don't call us Mexican American because we are rejected by the Americans. We cannot go back to being Mexicans. We're so many generations detached from Mexico, but also we are not Americans. We're Chicanos. And then there's this connection also to indigenous movements. And they will turn the tables on Anglos and say, well, you know what? We have indigenous roots, going all the way back to, in the case of some people in what used to be northern Mexico, going back to the same indigenous nations that oftentimes were not recognized, or that these children or captives were sold to the Spanish or to the Mexicans, or indigenous nations from central Mexico, like the Aztec Empire. And they'll say, we have always been here. We are the indigenous people of what you call the American West. You are the newcomers. So don't call us outsiders. Don't call us Mexicans. Don't call us non-Americans. We are more American and we're more Western than you are. So that's a very interesting twist. And what I argue that makes the case of the Chicano movement in Colorado so special is that it is very national in scope for such a place that is so far away from, say, Texas or California or the U.S.-Mexico border. So if you look, for example, at the work done by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who are considered pillars of the Chicano movement, it's very, very regional, very localized, to central California. If you look at the case of Reyes Lopez Tijerina, it's very much centered on the land grants of northern New Mexico. But in the case of Colorado, there's a domestic component, but also there's a national component. There's this perception that all Chicanos are on the same boat, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, whether you have been here for 9 generations or 1 generation, whether you're wealthy or not, we are all brown people and we're racialized in the same ways by the Anglo establishment. We will never be like them. We don't have to be like them, and therefore we reject the American way. And of course, as you may imagine, that got them in trouble with the authorities, but also with their parents, with a more conservative Mexican-American generation that came of age in the 40s and fought in the war in the 50s. And they were like, my kids are going crazy. This is insane. The way to survive in America is to bow your head and keep it low and hopefully assimilate or allow or be allowed to assimilate. In the Chicano movement, we see a total rejection of American assimilation, and some people would even call for a carving out of physical space of a Chicano homeland, kind of a movement to detach themselves from the United States, or at least from American culture.
That's interesting. I would point listeners to the work of Jerry Cadava, who's done some work on conservative political. So, like, when we talk about all these civil rights movements, one thing that makes the Chicano rights movement is that there's a real strong vein, a conservative tradition amongst Hispanic populations in the United States that persists, right, in ways that was unique, I think, from some of the other marginalized groups who are fighting for their rights. And I think Cadava, he actually is speaking here in, I think just in a couple of weeks, but he's done some really great work on that. I wanted to move us to the kind of this last section of the last couple of decades, the post-NAFTA world, where you shift your focus to the Western Slope and immigrant, often very transient labor, often servicing the amenities industries, the ski industries. What's unique about this story, this more recent and ongoing story? And then how does it then interface with all of these previous generations and locations in Colorado?
Yeah, I would say that this is my favorite chapter. I really enjoyed the field work for this one because it was something that I was not expecting. I mean, you think about the Western Slope is kind of like the forgotten part of Colorado, the rural, laid back, some people say backward part of Colorado, these, boom and bust towns out there. But there's a story going in there. There's a revival going through the Western Slope with all these new West economies up in the mountains, the ski resorts, places like Vail and Aspen. Further downriver, you have towns like Grand Junction that are becoming a major hub for retirees. There's an amenities industry. There's transportation. You have the wine industry in the Grand Valley. So there's this revival, this resurgence, this reinvention of the Western Slope, and of course that means that jobs are being created, and Latinos will gravitate to where the jobs are. So what you have here is a post NAFTA, because NAFTA is like a turning point in relations, particularly economic relations between the United States and Mexico migration. All of a sudden, all these opportunities open up. There's all this demand for cheap labor on top of the old West industries of the Western Slope, like cattle and sheep ranching, like oil and gas. But this like new. Now there's a booming construction in places like Aspen, Vale, but also in places like Montrose and Grand Junction. And Latinos are needed for those jobs. There's a service industry. So this is a new generation, and it's a highly transnational generation. And that is what is so fascinating. I interview these people, and these people are in constant contact, not only with Mexico, but even with a particular village in Mexico. I interviewed indigenous Mexicans, Cora people in Gunnison, those that already have their green cards, and some of them are even U.S. citizens. On what is a Holy Week, that is the week leading up to Good Friday, they go back to their villages and they participate in the festivities, in the indigenous/Christian festivities around Holy Week. So these people are in contact with their villages, with their hometowns in ways that were pretty much impossible to previous generations because, again, of the advances in communications and transportation technology. So there's this back and forth that was so difficult for early generations that simply had to circle the wagon and take it. So these people are highly mobile, highly connected. There's a middle class already developing, and with businesses that cater to their needs. So it's a fascinating new frontier where you can firsthand witness, how many of these towns, this what I call the downriver, down I-70 towns from Vail and Aspen, how these towns are changing. These were boom and bust towns that people just left, and all of a sudden Latinos came and revived. We're talking about places with names like Rifle or Parachute or Silt, places that you just drive down, on your way to from Vail to Grand Junction. There's this revival, and it's thanks to these Latino immigrants. One of the arguments that I make is that Latino immigrants or Latinx immigrants not only follow on economic trends, but oftentimes are also drivers of these economic trends in the new West economies.
And isn't there also in this new generation a greater diversity of where they're coming from? They're not just coming from Mexico, they're coming from all points south in Latin America. Does that change not just the makeup of these communities, but like how they function? How are they less cohesive? Do they get along in different ways? How does that change this kind of Spanish-speaking population?
It's a very different dynamic. So, for example, in the San Luis Valley, I encountered these Guatemalan immigrants, and these are mostly indigenous Guatemalan immigrants going to the heartland of the Hispano community in Colorado. People that have been there for 6, 7, 8 generations, and all of a sudden in the 80s, 90s, these refugees from Guatemala's civil war started arriving, And some of these people didn't even speak Spanish.
Yeah, they speak like Mayan, like
Yeah.
Quiche or like some Mayan languages.
Wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a large Canjobal community. Once I had to interview this woman through her husband. She will speak in Canjobal and then he will speak translating to Spanish, and we will go back and forth. So it's another layer that is added, and of course, sometimes you have the old prejudices of the people that have been here for many generations, and they feel that these newcomers are unsophisticated or unaware of norms, cultural norms. They fear also kind of I would say, retribution from the Anglo majority that will lump them up with the newcomers, and call them Mexicans. And here we have the case of Ken Salazar, former senator from the state of Colorado and Secretary of the Interior, U.S. ambassador to Mexico until recently. Ninth generation Coloradoan with Hispanic roots going to northern New Mexico. He has been called a dirty Mexican to his face, by people who are angry with him. So there's always, this, it's in the subtitle of my book, there's always this struggle for equality for people that have always been here, that have always been part of Colorado's story, but somehow they are seen as outsiders, as eternal, perpetual outsiders. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic. Also, you see it reflected on the Front Range as jobs have been created in the Front Range. Many companies moving from the East Coast, from the Midwest, from the West Coast to Denver, relocating there, and that brings Latinx professionals from other places in the United States. I'm from points south of the border, so there's this middle upper class migration of highly educated professionals to the state of Colorado that come from other parts of Latin America. And that's another layer of complexity to the what I call the Latinx cake that has been left outside.
So, and I guess the big takeaway is, if any of you think that you understand Latino history in Colorado, it is infinitely messier and more complicated than you think. And chronologically, in terms of where, and just in every way conceivable, it is so much messier, which is great. Which is why your book's a really important contribution. It gets us again taking things that we think we're familiar with and we think we know the story, and realizing, oh, I did not know the story.
As is the case with pretty much, I guess, any group in the American West,
Yeah.
which makes, and this is my argument, which makes Latinos even more mainstream.
Yeah.
They are not exceptional in any way. It's a very old, well-known American story. It's just, as one of my sources said, it's that Latinos are still like a mystery to the Anglo population, particularly to newcomers to the state of Colorado.
Well, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you let's kind of move away from the details of your book and ask you a little bit bigger picture question. And then we can wrap up because I want to hear about what you're working on next. So there are innumerable other ethnic minority groups with discernible, identifiable populations, unique identities in the American West. And I really love when scholars with outside expertise, who maybe, American West historian or scholars, not the primary hat that they put on, right? But they have, it's like you were an political scientist, expert in ethnic studies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and you bring your expertise to my world, to my field, the American West, and you add all kinds of new knowledge and interpretations that Western scholars like me, first of all, we wouldn't even know what questions to ask, or you bring so many new questions, and you produce things that we wouldn't be able to. And I find that really exciting. I've mentioned this, I think, before. There's this guy, I think he's at UNC Charlotte. His name's Steve Sable, and he's a historian of Kazakhs in Russia and Russian colonialism. And at one point, one of his colleagues does Western history convinced him to do a little comparative project on Russian Kazakh relations compared with U.S. Lakota relations. And he started coming to our conferences, and he comes semi-regularly. And I don't speak Kazakh or Russian. I never could have done that kind of work. But he's brought some really fascinating stuff for us to think about. So here's my question. Do you have advice for scholars of other, be it ethnic groups, minority populations, others in the West, whose training and background is rooted maybe in those home countries, say like in Latin America or elsewhere, but that might want to do some research or write about their immigrant counterparts here in the West, be it populations with centuries long, roots in the American West, or newer immigrants? What guidance or words of caution from maybe missteps that you've made things that have proved especially productive. Like, how would you encourage them to come and play in the American West as well?
I would say, first of all, go wide, widen the scope of your research. We and this is obviously a very Western trope. We think of the American West as so exceptional. It has been exceptional in the cultural realm and in the foundational myth of the United States. But when you start comparing it to other parts of the world, it is maybe less exceptional, or there are so many elements, so many overlapping enemy and elements, because it's not only a Western history, but also it's a history of migration. It is a history of the expansion of capitalism. It is the expansion of globalization. It is about transnational migration, and those are global phenomena that, even though take place in the American West, do not take place solely in the American West. So there are many overlapping points, and of course, there are very local nuances that we have to become familiar with. But we see that these stories are really not that different. The context may be, the background, the geography may be different, but it's pretty much the same movement of people and capital and political influence as a nation that eventually becomes an empire. The United States expands regionally and around the planet.
So maybe it's not as daunting as some might think.
No, actually, I think that we could all benefit from using different lenses, go beyond the traditional lenses, the traditional analytical lenses, to look at the American West, just like people have to look at the South as a dependent region, from the North. We can do the same with the East, or increasingly the West Coast and the interior Mountain West. And what is interesting, I mean, many people in Latin America are establishing those kinds of comparisons. There's a rich tradition, for example, in Mexico about, for example, the expansion of the railroad in Mexico in the late 19th century under President Diaz in many ways parallels the expansion of the railroad industries. The consolidation of ranches, the land grab that is taking place in northern Mexico in the late 19th century, early 20th century also parallels the so-called conquest of the West, the displacement, the massacres of indigenous people. They're confining them not perhaps to reservations, but to lands that are significantly smaller than their original territories. Many ways parallels the expansion of the United States. And you can even go to the places like Argentina. Argentina has its own conquest of the West and of the Patagonia that in many ways mirrors what happens in the U.S., because it's not only an American story, but it's a story of migration, of settler colonialism, of the expansion of capital industries, of globalization, transnational migration.
Well, that's exactly what you've done. And that's what's so great about you bringing your outside expertise. Or I've always said if I did speak Russian, I would do a comparative project about comparing Russian eastward expansion with American westward expansion. But I need someone who speaks Russian to do that project. I need someone who's an expert in Argentina to bring their Argentine expertise to do comparative work with the American West, right? So thanks for joining kind of this growing group of scholars who have, in a way, intentionally or not, done just that and really enriched the field of Western studies in some great ways.
You're very welcome. Maybe you have another edited collection in the making there.
Yeah, don't even get me started. I have so many that I want to do and just not enough time, not enough years in my life. Well, speaking of which, I know that you're working on some more stuff, which is going to kind of continue in this vein. Tell us about what your next project is.
Yeah, so it was a natural development. I live in northern Colorado. Actually, I live north of Fort Collins in a small exurb of Fort Collins called Wellington. I'm just 30 minutes away from Cheyenne, the capital of Wyoming. So I said, well, what about a book about Latinos in Wyoming? And here's a different dynamic, because there's no homeland, there's no Hispano or Latinx homeland. It's a highly mobile, highly transnational migration. And you cover in your podcast A Billionaire Wilderness, in which the author talk about this presence in Teton County, and specifically what's the name of the town?
Jackson.
Jackson, yeah. I think about the valley, Jackson Hole. Yeah, Jackson, of this highly mobile Mexican, specifically Tlaxcalan community there, that they clean the rooms, they clean the houses, they work in construction, and these people are constantly in contact and moving back and forth between Jackson, Wyoming, and Tlaxcala in Mexico. And then there are other places like, for example, there's a small town in southern Wyoming called Rawlins.
Yeah.
Rawlins has the state penitentiary there. Well, Rawlins is more than 50% Latino, mainly first generation Mexican nowadays. And that population has surged in the last 10 to 20 years. It has come out of left field. No one was seeing that happening. And they're very closely connected to the extent that norteño bands that used to go up to Denver for shows, now they're going to Little Rawlins, and they're like a sellout there. So there's something going on, and I'm kind of putting my ear to the ground and listening about to that.
You need to do some oral histories with some of these bands, like figure out who's touring where, and that's that's a fascinating entry point into figuring out what's going on, right? And then you get to go to lots of concerts. This seems like a great project.
Yeah, pretty much just follow the flow of money, the flow of remittances. But right now, Latinos are like 10% of the population of Wyoming, another state that historically, for very good reason, has been imagined as a very white state. Well,
I think 10% is a lot higher than people would expect.
Pretty much. And I believe that there's a massive undercount probably as a result of the 2020 census taking place right in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, Ernesto, congrats on the book. It's really great, and I really appreciate, again, this outside perspective contribution you brought. I think it's awesome, and I hope you can go talk to all of your other friends who work outside the American West and tell them to come play here too, because we'd welcome them with open arms. We're really a very big tent field, I would like to think. So.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for the invitation. It has been an honor.
All right. Well, I'll hopefully to see you in person soon, Ernesto.
All righty. Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native but Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind. Cheers.